a few more people coming in, filtering in, but. So on behalf of Daniel Morgan Graduate School, I would like to welcome everyone to today's event, Just War Reconsidered, with Lieutenant General James Dubik. I'm Frank Fletcher, Director of Lectures and Seminars. Introducing today's guest is our Dean, Dr. Stephen Meyer. Dr. Meyer.
Thank you, Frank. It's a pleasure to welcome you here this morning. It's a real honor to welcome my friend Jim Dubik. Jim retired from the Army in 2008 as Lieutenant General. He is now Senior Fellow at the Institute for the Study of War. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the National Security Advisory Council, the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. He's got too many teaching accolades and academic accolades to really go through. We will spend a whole hour talking about Jim's background if we did do that. Jim had lots of operational experience in places like Afghanistan, Japan, Korea, Thailand, Bosnia, Haiti, Panama, Honduras, and NATO countries. Jim has a number of firsts to his name. He stood up the Army's first Striker Battalion, Brigade Command Combat Team, for example. He appears frequently on news channels, BBC, CNN, Fox, NPR, Sky News, Canadian News, and so forth as a commentator. He is going to be talking this morning about his latest book, Just War Reconsidered. He has got a new book coming out on Walzer and War. When is that coming out, Jim?
It'll be this summer.
This summer on Michael Walzer and War 40 years after Walzer's publication. I think probably with all the wonderful things Jim has done, the best thing he ever did was marry Sharon, his wife, and also a very good friend of mine. Jim?
True.
You want to sit there? You want to stand?
I'll sit right here.
Okay, fine. Go ahead.
So thanks, Steve. I appreciate it, Frank. Thanks for the help setting this up. Thanks to all of you for taking the time. I'll talk a little bit about the book, maybe 20 minutes, 25, and we'll open up your questions and comments, because that's the most exciting time. I'll start with saying a few words about how this book started. This is it. If you haven't bought it, I recommend you buy it. You don't have to read it. I get paid for it. Just so you buy it, and old Steve, every 26 cents helps as we're going along. So it's out in paperback. You can read it on Kindle also. I recommend you don't buy the audio book, though, especially if you're going to play it in the car, because you'll be sleeping and it'll be an accident. The book actually started in 1978. I was the adjutant of the 2nd Ranger Battalion at the time, the S1, and I got this call from infantry branch. Jim, would you like to get a master's degree in philosophy and teach at West Point? Well, I mean, the guy was Harry Axon, a good friend of mine. I said, Harry, is this a joke? What are you doing? Where am I really going? And he said, no, there's a cheating scandal at West Point in 1976. And part of the result was they wanted line officers to go back to school and teach ethics at West Point. Well, my bachelor's degree is in philosophy. And so when the infantry branch got their 2 allocations, infantry use supply 2, they queried the computer and my card got spit out. And that was how it worked back then. And so he said, you're it, buddy. I need you to fill this hole. Okay, fine. So I enrolled in Johns Hopkins because I wanted to get a PhD as long as the Army was going to pay me to go to school for 2 years. So I enrolled for a PhD with a master's en route, thinking that while I was teaching, I could finish writing my dissertation. This was a very bad plan. I did finish all the language requirements, the oral and written comprehensive examinations. But by the time I did all that, my 3 years at West Point was up. So I went down to Baltimore. I didn't go to the sites here. I went to the Baltimore campus and asked the chairman of the philosophy department, would you give me a letter saying that I can be a student in absentia while I'm on active duty and waive the time and the pay requirements? And he was very gracious. He said, yeah, sure. So he writes this letter up, he signs it. He's thinking this might take 2 or 3 years. This was 1982. 2010, I returned to Johns Hopkins with this onion skin carbon copy paper in a document protector. And of course, the chairman is long since gone, had not died, unlike most of my professors by this time. And I gave this to the chairman and said, look, I'd like to come back and finish my PhD. Well, they were very kind and said, okay, well, can you prove you were here? And I said, yes, because Sharon is a very fastidious record keeper. And so she went down to the basement and pulled out, Johns Hopkins folder, and there all my transcripts, all the letters I got that said I passed this and I passed that, and this letter from the chairman. And so I gave them my stuff, and they said, okay, we'll get back to you. So I have this image of them now going into their basement and pulling my cold case box, off of the shelf, blow the dust off it, and 6 or 7 months later I get called, hey, you were here. And we'd like to talk to you and see if you can do this. This is now 2011, I think. Ultimately, they said, yeah, you can come back. You must take at least 1 year to write your topic, and then we'll pick a committee we'll pick a chairman for you, you pick a committee, blah, blah, blah. So I finished 2012 and finished 2014 and published this book 2016. So that's how this ended. I had 3 committee guys, 1 philosopher, 1 strategist, Elliot Cohen from the SICE, and Steve and David, a political scientist, because I wanted to, kind of mix up, the war is kind of a mixed up thing. Not a single discipline, and they guided me through this. It was great. It was a typical dissertation, and of course the dissertation was not this thin, because his dissertation had to be thicker. So it was thicker, and I had to take out all the philosophy terms and make it a readable book. I hope you find it is readable. So that's how this thing started, and it came out 2016. Most of you know that just war theory has 3 parts. The going to war, jus ad bellum, in war, jus in bello, and after war, jus post bellum. And what I tried to look at is just the middle part, jus in bello. And I did that because I saw that there was a gap in the traditional just war theory. And I use Walzer as a perfect example of traditional just war theory. He's written a book, Just and Unjust Wars. It's in its 5th edition. I mean, it's used almost everywhere in the United States, anywhere, and that's all he wanted to focus was the United States. And the gap is this. When he looks at jus in bello, he looks at it only from a tactical perspective, and he starts by making this claim, which almost everyone accepts, of a hard line between going to war, which is the responsibility of political leaders, and conducting the war, which is the responsibility of soldiers and generals. And he draws that hard line at the very beginning of his book, and then goes on to analyze jus in bello, or jus ad bellum, as primarily responsibility of political leaders, and he gives out a whole bunch of case studies. And then he looks at jus in bello, and he talks about soldiers and generals. And for me, my experience is that there is no such hard line, especially at the operational and strategic level, that political leaders are very much involved in the conduct of war. And if you define justice in the conduct of war solely at the tactical level, you've left out a big part of the actual conduct of war. And if you want to have a practical moral theory, which just war theory is supposed to provide some practical guidelines on the moral dimension of war, and you leave out a big hunk, it's not very practical. And so this is the focus. I wanted to go beyond the tactical side. And if you read Walzer, or I mean practically anybody else too, from Augustine on, jus in bello is defined as what's a legitimate act of war, what's the proportional response in a legitimate act of war, what's the difference between a combatant and non-combatant, how can I employ the principle of double effect. These are all tactical principles. They're fine, there's nothing wrong with them. But when you start asking the question, well, what about the responsibilities for senior generals and political leaders? Well, what about the principles that should govern their actions? And so you're left with no framework to use in trying to determine whether or not at the operational strategic level, senior leaders are attending to the moral dimension of war at their level. So that's what I tried to build. So the first two chapters make that case. And for me, it was a relatively easy case, and I did it first by identifying fighting and waging. The conduct of war has two parts, fighting and waging. And waging war is the operational strategic level, and fighting war is the operational and tactical level. Once I did that, I used several case studies to say, okay, here's how waging war looked. Hey, the Continental Congress was very much involved in the Revolutionary War. Lincoln was certainly very much involved in the campaigns and the conduct of war in the Civil War. FDR, I mean, just go down the list. And they are interested because war is by nature a political act. And it's not just using violence, it's a lot of political capital for the president and his administration. So you can't separate that. So the first thing I tried to do was just say, look, the conduct of war is two parts, and the second part's not attended to. And so if it's not attended to, you got to fill the gap. So the next step in the argument was, okay, well, when you look at waging war, this operational strategic level, you're automatically into trying to understand the civil-military relationship in the United States. Again, that's all I'm interested in the United States. If whatever I say it has more applicability, fine, but I didn't aim at that. It was hard enough to figure us out. So I didn't really want to have a claim larger than that. So waging war involves the relationship of the civil and military, not just the president and secretary of defense and the generals. All wars also involve money, so secretaries of treasury and commerce are involved. All wars involve diplomacy, therefore the secretary of state's involved. All wars involve intelligence, therefore the intelligence community. So the civil-military relationship is much more complex than the Department of Defense talking to generals, or the president talking to generals, although most of the books you read focus on that kind of relationship and that kind of dialogue. The dialogue is much richer. So then I asked myself, okay, well, where did all this start in the United States? You go to Huntington's Soldier State, and Huntington starts off by drawing the distinction between a social imperative and a functional imperative. And what he says, rightfully so, I think, is that you want it in the United States, you want an army that can actually function, that can achieve its purpose. At the same time, you want to make sure that it's not so strong or so involved in the United States that it kind of takes over the civil or the civil function of the government. So the social imperative is, hey, keep control of the military. The functional imperative is make sure it's functional and it's good. And the relationship should be a balance between these two. Well, this is okay, except it makes the next step in saying, and to get this balance right, we civilian people will authorize you, this military people, a semi-autonomous zone in which you conduct war. And we'll let you do that. And you promise, your side of the bargain, to be apolitical, to stay out of politics. And that way the social imperative and the functional imperative can be in balance. Well, again, this is the hard line that Walzer drew himself. Now, Walzer, I don't think ever read Huntington. I asked him that, and he said he didn't, so I trust him. But he came to the same conclusion. that there's just semi-autonomous zones. They're not. So as good as Huntington, good as he did identifying the social and functional imperative, and as good as he did as identifying the need for civil control of the military, his semi-autonomous sphere stuff just doesn't work. So I went then to my buddy Peter Fever, professor at Dubik, who wrote Armed Servants, and said, well, maybe he's got the answer. He does not have the answer. He's a nice guy. I love him. We have a good time together. We've been on a number of panels. We joke around. He's a great drinking buddy, but he is just flat wrong on a civil-military relationship. Of course, he would say to me, he's just flat wrong on a civil-military relationship. That's why we get along so well. But he uses this framework called the principal-agent framework, where civilians are principals and military are agents. And he defines working. He says, look, the civil-military relationship works when the agents do what the principals want the way they want it done. He calls that working. And anything else is shirking. If you're doing anything else except doing what they want, how they want it done, you're shirking. I think this has already kind of got my hair on as I read this book, because this is a definition of a toxic relationship, not a good relationship. You're not going to get a good dialogue out of a relationship like that. I mean, if you operate your marriage that way, you're not going to get very good marriage, and certainly you're not going to get the increase the probability that you're going to have a good wartime decision by operating that. Then he adds on to that elected officials, not just the President, Secretary of Defense, elected officials have a right to be wrong. And I said, Peter, you got to be kidding me. First off, it's not all elected officials. The mayor of Erie, Pennsylvania has nothing to say in the civil-military relationship. So really you're talking about the President and the Secretary of Defense, because by law, they have final decision authority. So the right that they have is not the right to be wrong, especially the use of somebody else's life. But what the right that they have is the right to final decision authority. And like all rights, there's a corresponding obligation, and the obligation is to use that right responsibly. That's the real issue in a civil-military relationship. He did not agree with that, so I'll just tell you flat off. And he uses Vietnam as an example of a good civil-military relationship. Oh yeah, and he spends a lot of time. And it's good because the military worked in the definition he said. The fact that 64,000 people's lives were lost and without attaining a strategic aim, in that midway through the war, everybody knew that the strategy wasn't going to work. Immaterial. Wow. And I said, Peter, you can't, this doesn't work. He wanted to be the new Huntington. And I said, you can't be the new Huntington with this theory. Huntington has two imperatives, social and functional. You have only a social imperative, because what you're talking about is a civil-military relationship with one item in mind, and that is control of the military, civil control of the military. Well, that's not enough. It's social and functional. And so I had to go on. Said, thank you, Peter, very, very much for your contributions, but I got to look for another model if I'm going to try to understand the moral dimension of waging war. This is not going to be it. So I went to Elliot Cohn, a good friend of mine, also Supreme Command. And so what I'm looking for again now is how to account for the moral dimension of the three important responsibilities of senior political and military leaders in the conduct of war. Number one, identify strategic aims that are actually achievable, and then align military and non-military strategies, policies, campaigns that increase the likelihood of achieving those aims. That's the first responsibility. The second, set up an organization or some kind of decision-making method so that you can actually translate the plan into execution, because no one wins a war with a plan. You win the war by executing, and then adapting as the war unfolds. And if you can't translate your plan into action and adapt as the war goes on, you don't have an organizational capacity, that you're not going to, likelihood of winning is pretty low, unless you're fighting someone really stupid. And then the third is to maintain legitimacy in the eyes of the American people. And you do, so these are the three responsibilities that the first two chapters lay out. I go to Beaver and say, well, can you account for this? No, because if you have a toxic relationship, you decrease the probability of any of those three responsibilities from being executed well. So then I go to Cohen. Unequal dialogue is what he calls it in the Supreme Command. And I think he's really onto something here, because the unequal dialogue between civil and military officials, and again, and he expands it beyond generals and presidents, although that's his primary focus, but he includes more. It's unequal because civilian leadership in our government, the President, Secretary of Defense, have final decision authority. This, I think, makes much more sense than a right to be wrong. They have the right to final decision authority, and that makes the dialogue unequal. It's unequal in that sense. But to Elliot, look, there's more to it than just the unequal side. If you look at it, the decision-making process of any president, it has a lead up to a decision, and then an execution of the decision, and then an analysis of how things turn out, and repeat the process. It's actually a cycle. And the unequal dialogue has a lot of equality in that cycle. And I cite three. First, the people in the dialogue are functionally equal. The voice of the Secretary of State, the voice of the Secretary of Treasury, the voice of the chairman, the voice of the combatant commander, the voice of the Secretary of Defense, these guys are all functionally equal, because all of their perspectives matter in figuring out the right set of strategies, policies, and campaigns, military and non-military, that increase or decrease the likelihood of success in achieving your aims. And all of them are equal in execution. If they can't make their departments run and execute together, not just individually, you decrease the probability of success. So first off, they're functionally equal. Second off, they're procedurally equal. And by that I mean the procedure of gathering information, analyzing information, presenting the information to each other and then to the final decision authority, however administrations do that, because they all vary. This is the procedure, and there are no procedural police except the participants. So if there are shortcuts in the process, if there is faulty information provided, if it's based on knowingly bad information or intelligence, there's no one other than the participants to cry foul. There's no one else. I mean, there's nobody sitting in the corner with a long cane when they hear a lie, snap it. No, that information's not right. Or you give a shortcut, you left out this. There's only themselves, so they're functionally equal, but procedurally equal. And then the third, I think they're morally equal, because they're all there together to help the final decision authority make the best decision possible, to execute it, and then adapt it as the war unfolds. There's no Pontius Pilate moment where the president makes a decision and everybody else washes their hands. Well, okay, I'm done now, because I don't have any more responsibility. Baloney. You read any of the memoirs and histories of participants in this, that they feel the weight of their decisions. So back to the civil-military dialogue. Okay, Elliot, unequal, I got it, but also equality. And so then, naturally, I've got to go and provide the next chapter where I present my own ideas. And I describe the civil-military relationship as unequal and equal, and as a continual dialogue, a set of continual dialogues. I use Bob Gates' book a lot, actually, Duty, which is a very good description of not just a dialogue, but a set of dialogues among the administration, between the defense and, or between the civil and the military, within the civilian departments involved, with our allies and partners. And this, I think, is a much more rich understanding of a continual dialogue, decision, execution, adaptation cycle that is aimed at strategies, policies, campaigns, military, non-military, to increase the probability of success, that are reflective of an organizational capacity to actually make decisions and take action, and that increase the likelihood of maintaining legitimacy in what you're doing. And so I adopt that as my model, and I make a very strong case to say the civil-military relationship is not about control of the military. That's established by law. That's established by custom, by tradition. There's no reason to be involved who's in control of whom. We know that. The President, Secretary of Defense, and the Congress acting as a body, they're in control. The issue for the civil-military relationship in the waging of war is to increase the probability of success or decrease the probability of success. And so you want to have a description of the civil-military relationship based upon that. So that's what I did. And at this point in the book, I also address the fact that the three responsibilities that I lay out, coherent aims aligned with policy strategies, organizational capacity, and legitimacy, these seem an awful lot like just strategic responsibilities. And it's because they are. The moral dimension of them are inherent in the strategic responsibility. It's not like a cake where you build the cake or bake the cake and then put the frosting on it. Well, we'll figure out what we want to do in the war, and then we'll get the moral frosting and see if we can put it on it. Now, some people approach it that way, but from my standpoint and my experience, these are very much, the moral dimension of your responsibilities is very much like an ingredient in the cake itself. When you're thinking through the aims and the strategies, the policies, the campaigns at the strategic level, just like you do at the tactical level, you're thinking about the moral dimension of what you're doing. And so I don't claim in the book that there are separate moral responsibilities. I claim that the responsibilities in waging war have a moral dimension. Why is that? Because they are ultimately linked to using lives. And anytime you're using someone else's life or controlling someone else's life, there's a moral dimension of what you're doing. And it's not just using. I mean, many of you here know much better than I. It's ending and damaging lives. Not just the lives of citizens who happen to be in uniform, but their families, the innocent, and very much so, the life of the political community. Because the longer a war goes on, the more the life of the political community gets altered. Sometimes better, most of the time worse. And if you're doing that, if you're using lives, and you're risking lives, innocent, political community, soldiers, families, this has a moral dimension. And so naturally, at the end of the last chapter, I then asked myself, okay, if these are the responsibilities, and this is the way the civil-military relationship should work, what are the principles that should guide civil and military leaders so that the moral dimension of their strategic responsibilities can play out? And I list 5. I'm not going to go through all 5. I'll tell you what they are, and if you want to know about them, I'll be glad to answer questions. Some are self-apparent or self-evident, others are pretty interesting. So the first is the principle of continuous dialogue. So it's not episodic dialogue. If you're gonna wage a war, then you gotta set up a system that's continuous. Because war, you don't make a decision and then revisit it 6 or 7 months later. Because, hey, war goes on, and a lot of things happen in 6 months. And if you can't have a continuous dialogue to make sure the gap between what you want to achieve and what you actually are doing, you're gonna be screwed. Second, the principle of final decision authority, which recognizes that the relationship is not about control, it's about responsible use. So really, I could have named that, and maybe should have, the principle of responsible use of final decision authority, but I didn't. Third, and this is an interesting one, the principle of managerial competence. And this principle played out actually just in the news the other day, I think, with the announcement of the new ODNI, or DNI. It's not just political reliability. It's about competence in running an organization. If you're going to be the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, the DNI, the Treasury, the National Security Advisor, if you're picked only on political reliability, this is wrong, because you will not be able to attend to the strategic responsibilities and the moral dimensions of them. So I lay that out. You've got to be able to run a department, because it's part of waging war is making your department work, not just individually, but in conjunction with the other departments and in conjunction with your allies. The fourth principle is the principle of war legitimacy, and I talk about some current work, and here I use Peter Beaver, who did a good job on this one, I think. Research that has concluded, and I think pretty clearly concluded, that the American people will support a war if they believe the war is the right war, that there's a strategy to succeed, and that we're making progress toward that strategy. That the legitimacy will, under those three conditions, will obtain. And when one or more of those three conditions erode, legitimacy goes down. And if you follow the polls just in Iraq and Afghanistan on what people think about the war, they're pretty well linked to those three things, which, oh, by the way, are war waging responsibilities. So waging war well, the title of my next book, is actually very much linked to sustaining legitimacy. And the last is a principle of resignation. I believe, and I believe very strongly, that the civilian and military senior leaders should have the option to resign. It should be the last resort. It should not be done lightly. But just as we expect our soldiers not to be amoral automatons on the battlefield, we cannot say to our senior leaders that you no longer have moral agency. You have a picture of me up as a lunch star. I hardly recognize myself as I walked in there, but it reminded me of the getting my box of cool general officer stuff. So when you get promoted, you get this box. Literally, it's a box that comes to your house. Brown opened up, and Sharon opened mine. She was
of course,
and I wasn't. She wanted to see what was in it, so she's going through it. So you open up the box and you get the cool belt, little black belt with a American seal on it that you wear for official things. You get a license plate you can put on your official car, flag, indoor flag and outdoor flag, very cool. And you get a bunch of stationery, 1-star stationery, and every time you get promoted, you turn that in and get the next star stationery. So all this cool stuff comes, but there is something that's not in that box, and it's not a return envelope for your conscience. And so I think the principle of resignation is very important to remind senior officers and civilian officials that they do not yield their conscience upon promotion to senior ranks. And so without the principle of resignation, senior political and military officials are reduced to moral automatons. Now, is it problematic? Yeah, sure. Did it involve judgment? Yeah, sure. Could some people resign under petty or foolish conditions? Absolutely. But the risk, without recognizing principle of resignation, is that the country has no way to recuperate from bad decisions. And this, I read this book called Exit, Voice, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty by Albert Hirschman, who talks about resignation, exiting an organization as a way to help the organization recuperate from bad decisions. Now, you should always use your voice first. This is the last resort, resignation. And quite frankly, look, if you resign, they'll just get somebody else. But they'll get somebody else, in your conscience at least, you will have done your duty to the country and to your soldiers. And in the book, I use Harold K. Johnson, Chief of Staff of the Army during the Vietnam War, as an example of a guy who thought through this, who went to the White House to resign and then kind of reneged on himself. And how later in his life he gave himself low marks in his moral courage for not having the courage to resign. He recognized that President Johnson would just get someone else, but he gave himself low marks for not acting as his conscience really demanded. So that's where the book ends. I make no claim that this is the final word on senior military and political responsibility in the conduct of war, but I'm very happy to provide the first word and at least start the argument about what are the moral dimension of responsibilities at the senior political and military level. So over to you.
If you raise your hand, I have a microphone here, and I'm sure there will be quite a few questions.
Oh. Thank you very much, sir, for your remarks. Tom Spore from the Heritage Foundation. A question for you about the word war, and that's something I'm grappling with, and because there's a lot of talk in town about ending forever wars, and I don't know, I can't remember the dates exactly when we announced that the Iraqis were the lead in Iraq and the Afghans were the lead in Afghanistan, but those dates have come and gone. So
I can tell you the answer in Iraq.
Yeah. And so I wonder, is the word war, and there was all this speculation about when Soleimani was killed, does this mean war with Iran? And I just wonder if war the most useful word we have anymore, because it seems so binary. We're either at war or not at war. And how should we think about this nowadays? Because just and bello just seems like, well, this only takes effect when we're actually in war, and I can't remember the last time we declared war.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Matter of fact, I'm going to invite you to when my next book's published, because the first chapter is on this point. Look, we have, as a nation, we've overly restricted our understanding of war to conventional war, and we've drawn a threshold. Maybe it's Article 5 of NATO, let's call it that. When we're beyond that threshold, we're at war. We're below that threshold, we're not at war. Well, that's not true. Right. And so we have to figure out a different way to talk about the use of force to attain your strategic aims. And the use of force, not just kinetic military force. So I think that we should start talking about conceptual equivalence of war, and say that war, as understood as the realm of using force or forces to attain your strategic aims, is a unitary whole that we have arbitrarily cut in half with this threshold of war. Let's understand the threshold for what it is, but let's understand the unitary phenomena as it is also. And I think understanding the conceptual equivalent of war below the threshold and above the threshold really helps understand that the three responsibilities I talk about apply below the threshold just like they do above the threshold, and help us think through how to work below the threshold much better than we are. I think it also helps us, and I think it also helps us in one of our biggest strategic weaknesses, and that's the use of multiple elements of power in the exercise of war. We define it again, above the threshold war kinetic, therefore it's military. Well, baloney. It's not even above the threshold of war, it's not just military, let alone below. So I think we got a lot, as a nation, a lot a lot of academic work to do on that.
We have
We've
a
got-
question here, and then we'll go there.
Okay,
and then-
good. All right.
Hi, Tom Dowling, I'm on the faculty here, I'm in charge of the intelligence program, but I want to speak to you about an observation, not a question. I spent 30 years in the Foreign Service, and I sat here today listening to your excellent presentation and thinking to myself, as somebody who spent his adult life inside the State Department, the Foreign Service, there has never been discussions like you had today, you're presenting, that I've ever been participant in or witness to in the State Department. The entire discussion about the role of force and about the responsibilities, and all, I've never been there.
Yeah.
I've been in lots of discussions on war, on our policies and what we do about stuff. But it really strikes me listening to this, and I agree this is an academic setting, but the military, the level of thought that military officers put into this is absolutely unmatched on the civilian side. And that is not praise for the civilian side. So I thank you for doing it, but I really, in a way, found it kind of depressing that you're talking about important ideas that I've never heard addressed in the department, and I'm sure they're not being addressed now. So I don't want to go off on a big rant, but that's my observation.
Well,
Thank you.
actually, about 8 years ago, at the Institute for Study of War, we had the same conversation. And so we did an analysis of most schools of international studies, security studies, international relations, and found a huge hole in how to use force to attain strategic aims. And so we educate most of our civilian leaders not understanding the use of force in attaining strategic aims. When the civilians have, I would say, the dominant view or the dominant input at the strategic and grand strategic level, with no intellectual and historical background to what they're doing. So we went to a guy, Roger Hertog, in New York. Maybe some of you know him. We pitched to him to start a security studies program called the Hertog War Studies Program, specifically designed for civilians. And we take rising seniors, very top tier seniors, 20 out of 350, 400 applicants, and take them through a ranger school, intellectual ranger school of war studies. 2 weeks in the summer, and then offer them twice during the year. Roger is very generous in bringing them back to the United States if they're working or living outside for 4 or 5 day deep dives in the use of force. I think we need more of that.
Yeah.
In schools of international studies and security studies. There's nothing wrong with, I think. Well, you know, we got away from war, that's kind of not a good thing to talk about. Well, if it's not a good thing to talk about, it's not going to be very well waged. And we got a lot of evidence of that. So, you know, I think, I'm with you in your boat. I'd rant with you. Sure.
Is this on?
Yes.
Yes. Paul Goldstein, I'm CEO of Pacific Tech Bridge. It's a business consulting company that does strategic consulting in Japan in particular. The one thing I feel that you left out or thought about is the cultural dimension of warfare. And I think we're living in an era not only of a digital war right now, or undeclared digital war.
Right.
And the Chinese do not believe that there's a difference between war and peace. It's on
Or
a
the
continuum.
Russians.
Or the Russians. That's a little different question. So we don't prepare ourselves nor our society, not just in the government, but the society as a whole, for where we are in this world. And I take a Hobbesian approach and a more nation-state approach than looking at multilateral institutions to mitigate the issues of war and peace and all of that through the UN and all of that. So we're in a period, I think, a tipping point in which we have to find who we are as Americans and what is our identity as Americans in this world that we're in. Because for the last 30 to 40 years, up until this administration, whatever you think of the president is irrelevant right now, we were stuck in a world in which we were losing. We were losing our grounding as what we are as an American republic. We've sort of attenuated what we have been since the very founding of this republic. I believe we've been in a continuous irregular war since our founding. The American Revolution was an irregular war, and we never stopped. We were an anti-colonial force, fighting against colonialism to build our continental republic. We defeated the British, the French, the Germans, the Russians, to build our continental republic.
The Sioux,
We did that too, but there was sometimes justification for that,
Yeah.
because some of the Native American tribes fought with the French and the British against us.
Yeah.
So things happen in war.
Yeah.
So I just think the way we have to frame this issue is who are we as Americans? And what are we really fighting for as a moral justification of our existence? Is this great experiment worth living and dying for?
No, I think, I wouldn't agree with everything that you said, but I think in general, we do have to define ourselves. We had a pretty good, I think we had a pretty good understanding of who we were and our role in the world after World War II.
Yes, we did.
And did a good job setting up a scheme, a global scheme, that was very beneficial to us. It was also beneficial to other people. And because of that scheme, it built a world that, and we lost that sense, especially after the Cold War, because we thought, okay, it's all over now. We
The
won.
end of
Well,
history.
no, it's not. It wasn't. There was no way that it was over. It's never going to be over, to your point. So, I get that part. And I also take the point on the cultural side. Unlike us, back to the war as a unitary whole, the Chinese still understand that. The Russians still understand that. We're the global superpower that defined ourselves out of existence by cutting the phenomenon in half. And we do have to have a re-education for ourselves to put that whole back together and then ask ourselves, what kind of world do we want to help create? Not because we're nice guys. Well, we are nice guys sometimes, but we want to do this for our self-interest, enlightened self-interest of the United States. That's what drove the Marshall Plan and everything after World War II, was enlightened self-interest. It wasn't pure humanitarianism, but we got to get back into that mode. Certainly isolationism is not the answer, because that's not going to help. And certainly a tripolar world is not going to be a stable world. So what kind of world we haven't had that conversation, I think, and that's a worthy conversation to have.
So we'll go here now.
Thank you,
and then
John.
there, and then-
Hi, my name is Rick Pearson. I don't have any professional background here, but interested citizen. And I have, I guess, two questions. One, I started out wanting to ask based on your talk, and then secondly, stimulated by your first question. But this is a little bit beyond what you were, your topic, but the concept as far as just war goes, as far as how to actually fight the war. It seems that for most of world history, there was the idea of destroying the population of your enemy was a no-brainer. If you were going to invade a country or fight a war against a country, you didn't just kill their soldiers, you either killed their civilian population or took them captive. Obviously, that's changed, at least in theory, in recent years. And maybe you could just give me a little education as to where that comes from, and is it an actual legal principle now or just a concept? And then the other idea I just wanted to throw out based on the first question was, we're talking about what is war? And it can incorporate a lot of things besides actually using your military force. But the United States has a particular problem there in that the Constitution specifically gives the power to declare war to Congress. And this has gotten us into a whole lot of struggles ever since, especially in modern times, because war is so broad, and we're engaging in fighting all over the world without having declared war. But while China and Russia may not have that legal problem, we at least do, in concept, have this requirement. And so maybe you could just address that.
Well, okay, those are two pretty big questions.
I got all that.
Yeah, I'll, on the first one, look, the principles of the conduct of war are very settled in international law, in treaties that we have signed. And the principles of when it's justified to go into war, when it's justified, what kinds of war are justified, as well as the actions in war. So that's settled, and they're settled largely because of the repugnance of the absence of principles that you described. Most of this was post-World War II, or correction, post-World War I. Conventions, Geneva and Hague conventions, and then establishment of the UN and a bunch of other stuff. But all this is now relatively settled. Are there violations? Absolutely there are violations. As long as they're human beings, there are going to be violations of criminal codes and violations of international law. Do states always avert? No, so states always. Are states always interested in their self-interest? They're always. So in a perfect world, we wouldn't have this problem. We don't live in a perfect world, so we got most of these problems. But they're settled. And quite frankly, I don't want to return to a world without them. It's morally repugnant, the world without these laws. And I'd rather live in an imperfect world with the laws than an imperfect world without them. So if I could put that aside, just war theory on this side of the question is not a theory about pacifism. It's a theory that tries to find, in Aristotelian terms, the mean between extremes. So, for example, in jus ad bellum, the extremes are extreme realism and pacifism. If you're an extreme realist, look, you'll go to war for whatever reason you want. If you're a pacifist, you're never going to war. But somewhere between there, the just war theorists say, there should be justified reasons to resort to force. And they try to describe that. And it's always foggy. When I teach the course, I draw a cloud. It's clear on the extremes. The closer you get to the mean, the less clear it becomes. That's why every one of these decisions is a judgment, and that's why the civil-military dialogue in the United States is so important. Because the better, the richer the dialogue, the more likely the judgment you will make will be a good judgment, or the best you could make in a circumstance. That's all you can ask for. There's no perfect judgments, whether you're making them or I'm making them or we're making them together with the code of war. In the conduct of war, the extremes are absolute rights, you can't violate anybody's rights, or absolute utility. You do whatever you got to do necessary. Well, look, if you absolute utility, you don't need any rules. You're into the world you described. And if it's absolute rights, you can't hurt anybody. You're never going to fight. So again, it's how do you describe the mean there? And in the principles in the conduct of war are trying to describe that middle ground. And again, they're applied. And they're applied at the tactical level in the worst possible conditions by soldiers and leaders and lieutenants and sergeants who are under extreme duress. But these principles, you try to embed them. Are there going to be mistakes? Yeah. Are there mistakes sometimes understandable? Yes. Are there violations that are not understandable? Yes. So it's foggy in each case. Then you go to post-bellum, and it's justice or peace. If you're interested in justice, you'll never stop fighting, because there's no such thing as perfect justice. And if you're interested in peace, you'll stop right now. That's all you care about. So the principles of just ending of a war are trying to describe the conditions and the principles that apply, that you give up a little bit of justice and you give up a little bit of peace and figure this stuff out. So from my standpoint, just war theory is one of the most intriguing dimensions of war, because it's all judgment. But it's not just any judgment. It's how to apply these criteria, these principles, to the moral dimension of using lives, taking lives, which has consequences for each of us who've been involved. So I don't know if that helps you or hinders you,
Thank you.
but that's my take on it.
We have 2 questions over here, so.
She'll be okay. Good morning, good morning.
Still, yeah.
Got
Colonel,
1 minute
my
left.
name is Connor Clark. I'm a grad student, thank you so much, at University of Maryland in their public policy school, and I'm certainly hoping to work on the civilian side of national security going forward. That you said that turns out program was only open to rising undergrad seniors?
Yeah.
Dang,
Yeah.
all right. Well, my question comes from a class on intelligence and policy I took. And I remember the professor talking about that cycle in the same way you did on the informing policy. A decision was made. If you're in certain parts of the intel community, you'll be involved in carrying out, covert action, but it's that continuous cycle. I was wondering if you could speak to the role of intelligence in the military process of informing, deciding, execution, reviewing, coming back, and the role of intelligence, ethical use of intelligence. And is there a fundamental difference in between the way civilians should go about intelligence versus the way military affairs?
I don't think there's much of a difference. The cycle's still the same. The focus, the horizon that you're looking at militarily may be a little bit different. But then again, maybe not. You try as a military commander, whether tactical, operational, or theater strategic, to base your plans on your understanding of the overall situation, which includes intelligence aspects of both military and non-military dimensions of the situation. But intelligence, in my view, and military operations, in my view, have a shelf life. And that's why they're a cycle. I mean, if you make a decision, a military decision, on your best understanding of the situation at time 1, when you go to time X, you better start rethinking. And time X is sometimes not very long. And if you're going to hold to a plan based on what you decided at time 1, and you're at time like 6 months from now, or 7 months from now, and you're still holding on to that plan, you're holding on to some thin air. And the cycle is very much the same. I don't know if that helps you.
It does. Thank you for your answer and for your decades of service.
First a comment, and then I'll ask him if he would tackle a question. The comment about earlier by someone a fellow in the audience about our anti-colonial war and establishing a republic. Let me submit that our anti-colonial war was our version of a colonial war. That what we did was we colonized land that did not belong to the United States all the way to the West Coast. Manifest destiny was not established by God, it was established as a justification for colonizing the rest of the continent. The question, Jim, is on the functionality, equal functionality. Depending on how you define functionality, it strikes me that there is no equality of power or influence or authority, and maybe that means functionality. For example, during the run-up to the Iraq War, there were certainly people at a functionally equal level who were more influential, more powerful in the decision-making of that war. And I think that that's been true in many, many wars. I mean, for example, Condoleezza Rice was pretty much cut out of decision-making. It was essentially Cheney, Wolfowitz, so forth. How do you account for that then?
Well, first off, thanks, Steve. I think identifying functional equality as part of the civil-military relationship is first very important to establish that. Because if you don't think that they're functionally equal, it's easier for you to cut people out. And I completely agree with your assessment of how people were cut out. You can go to other wars. There are examples as well. And look at the Joint Chiefs cut out of many of the Vietnam decisions in the same way. But if you don't first identify, and I guess I used to be an IG, and so the first step of an IG is to understand how the system should work so that you know where it's not working. And so I think if you describe the civil-military relationship first as not a relationship to establish who's in control of whom, but one as to the means by which you identify increase or decrease the probability of success. And then second, identify both its equal and unequal aspects. And then third, describe those equal aspects as a cycle, not just an event, a dialogue, an execution, an cycle. Then you start identifying how the system should work, and recognizing that no actual system is going to work perfectly. But if you're in that dialogue, I think it's harder, or should be harder, for maybe the chairman at that point to say, hey, wait a minute, we're cutting out some of the functions that are going to be very important in the conduct of this war. Now, he may still be saying, tough tootsies, we're cutting them out, but at least he's able to you have a framework to operate. Without a framework, you're just out there as an individual. So that's how I respond to that.
So I think I'll ask the last question, and then we'll go, we have lunch. Thank you very much, sir. I would submit Lyndon Johnson's decision in 1968 after not winning the New Hampshire primary. He almost lost to Eugene McCarthy. In the context of the anti-war movement, absent campaign finance, McCarthy's was financed, and it was very viable. Johnson decided to not run again for president. I think that in some sense is the equivalent of a resignation. I would also submit that in 1975, we saw the Congress assert itself in a way that it had not during the conduct of the Vietnam War. They made sure through legislation they passed that it was absolutely impossible to spend any money in any way whatsoever to assist the Republic of South Vietnam. You couldn't transfer anything there. You couldn't move money, men, personnel, equipment around. It was an absolute, by legislation, veto-proof and end to the war. So it's...
Well, it goes back to your question over here. We have three branches of government on purpose.
Yes.
And the fact that sometimes Congress abrogates its responsibility to the executive branch, that's their choice, I guess. This is an example where they didn't abrogate it. And that's our system, like it or not. I would go back, your comment about re-election. This is also very common. You saw in World War II some of FDR's decisions related to his re-election. You certainly saw some decisions by Lincoln, very worried about his re-election in 1864 and how things were going with Grant, mauling his way down toward Richmond, or what I call the campaign of I-95. So it's, again, this is an example for me of why this hard line between military responsibility and civilian responsibility in the conduct of war doesn't exist. Political leaders are always going to be involved. in the conduct of war, because political capital and their political life, in the Johnson case, is very much involved in it. You can't expect them to say, General, good, now that we decided to go to war, you guys go do that. Let me know how it goes. I'll be back at the White House working on the economic policy. They're never gonna say that, because they've gotta be involved, their political life's involved. And so the hard line that Huntington draws, that Walter draws, this line does not exist. So, thanks. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Lunch.
Do we clap again?
After you try it.
You're welcome. Thank you. We have a disagreement.
Have
Serious
at it.
disagreement.
Have at it.
I just like that the University of Georgia.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Very close.
Yeah, how are you? Bill Caldwell still there? This was the president.
No, Jim Kruger.
Oh,
Him and I is like my brother and friend.
Did you meet her while stationed in
no, he was the president.
No, he's not, he's on the board of.
Oh, yeah,
Trustees. And transformed. They have 11 Fulbrights.
Wow. Well, he's the move.
He and I.
Yeah.
No.
Tell him I said
Oh, sure. You have a card.
Wait, I'm sorry, you have still?
Trade.
No, she's my mentor and protector.
I'll have to look up your work. That's
Too.
I'm actually considering the next
I've had
language.
those times.
Yeah, well, I'm equally strange than one of the.
I was in the first U.S. counterterrorism. Operation.
Oh, yeah, right.
That's what the Japanese.
275. Yeah, recruited.
Right,
I was one of the leftists.
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
And so you served there.
Well, and the thing about the anti-war, the decision of Johnson not to run, it wasn't just that he practically had a violent.
No, it was me.
But it was the anti-war movement.
I
I
appreciate
don't agree
your-
with a lot
your
of
intent service. Oh, yes, I'm
Citizens.
quite proximate.
There's a
But
Marxist.
that context.
Of course, maybe I'll send you mine, see what you,
Exactly,
exactly, I would love that.
You went so much so bad.
Well, this goes back, did you see the Ken Burns series?
Yeah.
The first chapter where Don Gregg was interviewed and said we framed the issue. It was not a global war against communism, it was whether we were going to fight for national liberation. And Ho was working for us. He was on our
So back to Blue Light, did you jump into Utah? We did an operation with
I'm going to
Blue
put
Light.
the microphone back. Nice to see you again. Good.
7, right.
Yeah, I joined in '78.
Ah, okay.
And I was with Colonel Rothman down at JFK World Trade Center. In Feinstein.
Yeah.
If you Google.
Two old people in the background.
Yes, Colonel Bob Martel.
India?
He may have been at one time in his career. Really, it was a pleasure.
Thanks.
There's a book by Alexander Atkins. I did my PhD in British systems. American stuff yet. General theory and general theories of strategy. Yeah, we can throw out again all the way because exactly what you said. More than I can see through the. I can send you my notes from the book.
Please, we have a space here.
Yeah, sure. Actually, I think the whole, the club was asking, the club has a whole understanding of war. We've just bastardized.
I used to work for Harry Summers.
Yeah, right.
And he does this book on Harry. And I did my doctoral. But he's wrong.
Yeah.
That is true, but I don't think I've ever really He was laughing, loving it, yeah. He was loving it.
I am, yes, Tom's Ford. Oh, neat. Oh, nice. Okay, great, yeah. That's true. Yeah. Right. Yeah, yeah, I tell all the young people, hey, you've got to get to these regions if you really want to study them, China or wherever. Yeah, you've got to go there, you know, and spend more than a semester. Yeah, it's loud.